I was 9 years old the winter the old field marshal died, and I have told this story more times than I can count, and every time I tell it I understand a little more of what I actually saw. That is the strange thing about being a child at a great event. You are there. You see it with your own eyes, closer than the men who would later write it down, and yet you understand almost none of it. You catch the size of a thing without catching its meaning. It takes you the rest of your life to grow up into what you witnessed, to walk back into that morning carrying everything the years have taught you, and finally see it whole. So let me tell it the way it comes to me now, with a grown man's eyes laid over a boy's. The kingdom was Marinhold, and the man we had come to bury was Field Marshal Lord Halloran, who had been old before my father was born. He was the last great soldier of a war that had passed out of living memory for almost everyone, a war whose name children learned the way they learned the names of the seasons, without ever truly imagining the cold of it. He had won a campaign that saved the realm, the Dunmer campaign, and he had spent the rest of his very long life as a kind of monument that happened to still be breathing. When he finally died, the whole of Marinhold seemed to exhale at once, the way you do when something you have always counted on is suddenly gone, and you understand for the first time that you had been counting on it. They laid him in state in the Abbey of St. Coram for 3 days, and on the 4th day they were to carry him through the great square of Kingsmere and bury him beneath the abbey floor with the old kings. My father woke me before light. I remember the cold of the room, and the cold of my own boots, and my mother wrapping a scarf around my throat so many times I could barely turn my head. I remember not understanding why we would stand for hours in the freezing dark to watch a box go by. I said something like that, and my father, who was not a man of many words, crouched down to my level and said, "Because some things you go and stand for, so that later you can say you did." I did not understand that either. I understand it now. It is, I think, the whole of what I have to tell you. The square was already filling when we got there, and it went on filling until I could not see where it ended. I have stood in big crowds since as a man, and I have never again felt a crowd so quiet. Thousands of people, tens of thousands, and the only sounds were feet shifting on the cobblestones, and the small dry coughs that travel through a winter crowd, and over all of it the abbey bell, tolling slow, one stroke and then a long silence and then another, as if even the bell did not want to hurry this. My father lifted me onto his shoulders so I could see. From up there the whole square opened out below me like a field of dark coats and pale faces, and at the far end, against the gray stone of the abbey, stood the guards. I want to tell you about the guards, because they are the heart of this, and because the boy I was got them entirely wrong. There were 2 long lines of them, running from the abbey steps out into the square, making a corridor down which the coffin would be carried. They wore the deep gray of the foot guard, with a single line of silver at the collar and tall dark caps and white gloves, and each man held his rifle reversed, the muzzle to the ground, the way soldiers carry arms for the dead. And they did not move. That was the thing that struck the boy first and hardest. They did not move at all. In all that cold, in all those hours, every one of them stood as if he had been cast in iron and set down on the cobbles, eyes forward, face still, breath the only living thing about him, and even the breath you had to look hard to see. I thought they were not really men. I am being honest with you. I thought, up on my father's shoulders, that they must be some kind of statue the king kept and only brought out for funerals, because no living person could stand like that, could hold so perfectly still while the cold worked into him. I leaned down and asked my father if they were real, and he said yes, and I did not believe him, and I spent a long while staring at the nearest one, waiting to catch him blink, the way you stare at a man pretending to be a statue, certain you can break him if you only watch long enough. The nearest one to us stood perhaps 40 feet away, at the mouth of the corridor where it opened into the square. He was young, I could see that even then, younger than my father, with a plain, steady face that gave nothing back to all the staring thousands in front of him. I did not know his name that morning. No one in the crowd did. We learned it later, all of us. The whole kingdom learned it, and I will give it to you now because he has earned having it said. Guardsman Edmund Caro. But that morning he was only the nearest statue, the one the boy on his father's shoulders had decided to break with the force of his looking. I could not break him. I want that on the record before I tell you what did. The procession came slowly. First the riders, then the drums, muffled with black cloth so that they did not crack the air but only thudded against it, a heartbeat for a body with no heart left. Then the great gun carriage, drawn by horses with their manes plated in black, and on the carriage the coffin under the old flag, and on the flag the marshal's sword and his cap. I remember the sword most. It caught what little light there was and threw a thin, cold line of it across the crowd as the carriage turned, and I followed that line with my eyes the way a child follows anything that shines. The crowd uncovered as it passed. That is a thing men did then and do still in some places. Take the hat from the head when the dead go by, and you could watch it travel through the square like wind through a field, hats coming off in a slow wave that moved with the carriage. My own father reaching up to lift me down a little so he could take his off and put it under his arm. By the time the carriage reached the mouth of the corridor, the whole square stood bareheaded in the cold, and the only covered heads left were the tall dark caps of the guards, who do not uncover, because for them the holding of the post is the salute, and a man cannot do two things at once with the whole of his discipline. So the carriage came on between the two gray lines, slow, toward the abbey, and the guards held, and the bell tolled, and 40 feet away from me Guardsman Caro stood like iron with the old flag and the old sword passing before his fixed and forward-looking eyes. And that, I thought, would be the whole of it. The box would go in, the bell would stop, my legs would be let down from my father's aching shoulders, and we would walk home and have something hot, and I would tell the other children I had seen the king's statues that were really men. That is the funeral I expected. A grand gray thing happening at a distance, the way grand things always happen to children, on the far side of a crowd to other people. What I did not see, what no one in that vast hushed square was looking at because we were all looking at the coffin, was the old man. He had been there the whole time. I have worked this out since, talking to others who were there, reading the few honest accounts. He had come earlier than my family, and he had been near the front against the rope, when the front was a comfortable place to be. But a great crowd is a slow tide. It does not mean to, but it moves, it presses. It folds the small and the old back into itself. And over the hours the old man had been carried backward without anyone laying a hand on him, simply by the gentle, endless shifting of bodies wanting to see, until he was no longer at the rope at all but 3 or 4 rows back, where a man of his height could see nothing but the coats in front of him. He was very old. Older than the marshal in the box, some said afterward, though I doubt anyone really knew. He was small the way the very old become small, folded down toward the ground, and he wore a coat that had been good once and was now only carefully kept, brushed and mended and brushed again, the coat of a man who has one good coat and means to be buried in it. And on that coat over his heart, he wore his medals. This is the part that the boy could not have understood and the man cannot stop thinking about. He wore the medals of the Ash Company. I have to stop and tell you what that means, because the whole of the morning turns on it and almost no one in the square knew, and the one man who knew was standing in a gray coat holding a reversed rifle, forbidden to move. The Dunmer campaign, the great campaign that made Field Marshal Halloran into a monument, had a cost. The way all such things have a cost, and the cost had a name, and the name was the Ash Company. They were the men who held the ford at Verran in the dead of that winter, while the rest of the army got across the river and away. They were told to hold for a day. They held for 3. By the time the relief reached them, the river had frozen and thawed and frozen again, and there was almost no one left to relieve. They had bought the campaign, bought the kingdom really, with their own bodies, and the kingdom had won because of it, and the man who commanded the army that lived because the Ash Company died was Lord Halloran, who never in all his long-honored life pretended otherwise. He spoke of them when he spoke of the war at all, the way a man speaks of a debt he can never pay. He had their names cut into a stone in the abbey. He went to that stone every year alone, until he was too old to walk, and then he had himself carried. But the men of the Ash Company themselves were gone. That was the whole point of them. They were the ones who did not come back. There had been a handful of survivors, pulled half dead from the ice, and over the decades the handful had become a few, and the few had become a rumor. And by the winter I am telling you about, everyone assumed the last of them had long since died, because no one had seen an Ash Company medal worn by a living man in 20 years. And here was one, standing in the crowd, folded down by the tide of bodies, in his one good coat with the company's medals over his heart, 3 rows back where he could see nothing, having come the way the very old come to such things, slowly and with great difficulty, and telling no one, to say goodbye to his old commander. His name was Walter Reeve. We learned that later too, the last man of the Ash Company. He had been a boy at Verran Ford, the youngest of them, and he had lived because an officer had thrown him down behind a dead horse and lain across him, and not gotten up again. And he had carried that for 60 years, the way you carry a thing you did not earn and cannot put down. And now the man who had commanded them all was going into the ground, and the last of the Ash Company had come to stand at the rope and lift his hand one final time to the only authority he had ever truly answered to. And the crowd, meaning nothing, wanting only to see, had quietly pushed him to the back where he could not be seen and could not see. I did not know any of this on my father's shoulders. I want to be clear about how blind I was, because the wonder of it when I finally understood was the wonder of seeing something I had been looking straight at the whole time. I had probably looked right past old Walter Reeve a dozen times in those long cold hours, the way you look past anyone small and gray and still in a crowd. He was nothing to me. He was a coat. It was Caro who saw him. Here I have to tell you a thing about Edmund Caro that the crowd did not know either, that came out only afterward, when men went looking, the way men always go looking once a thing becomes a story. Caro's grandfather had been at Verran Ford. Caro's grandfather had been Ash Company. He had not come back. He was one of the names on the Abbey stone, cut into it by the very marshal now lying in the box. And Edmund Caro had grown up a soldier's grandson in a soldier's family, raised on the cold legend of the company that held the ford, raised to know the badge of it the way you know your own name, raised to stand a little straighter when anyone said the words Ash Company, because that was his blood that had frozen into that river. So when in the long gray hours of holding his post, Guardsman Caro's forward-fixed eyes happened to take in the small folded old man 3 rows back in the crowd, the man no one else was looking at, his trained and motionless attention caught on something almost nobody alive could have caught on. The medals. The badge of the Ash Company, worn by a living man over a heart that was still, against everything, beating. He knew what he was looking at. Of everyone in that square of tens of thousands, he alone knew. He was looking at the last of the men his grandfather had died beside. He was looking at a survivor of Verran Ford, come to bury the only man who had ever fully understood what it cost him to survive. And he was watching that man be quietly, gently, unknowingly pushed to the back of the crowd, folded down out of sight, on the one morning in the whole remainder of his short remaining life that he had asked the world for nothing, but to be allowed to stand near the front and lift his hand. And Edmund Caro was forbidden to move. I cannot tell you what those minutes were inside him. No one can. He never made a great speech about it afterward, never wrote it down, never traded on it. But I have stood as a man in the cold of a hard duty, and I think I have stood near enough to the edge of it to guess, and I will tell you what I guess, and you can take it as a man's honest guess and nothing more. I think the whole of his life stood up inside him and argued. The oath stood up first. Because an oath is real, and a post is real, and the man who breaks his post breaks something that other men are leaning on without knowing it, and Caro had given his word, and a man's word is supposed to be the one thing the cold cannot reach. To leave the line was to fail. There was no soft way to think about it. The drill is the drill because the drill is what holds when feeling would not, and a guard who leaves his post because his feelings move him is. by every hard rule he has sworn to, simply a guard who has failed. But the debt stood up too. The debt that the dead man in the box had carried for 60 years, the debt the whole kingdom owed and had cut into a stone and then forgotten to feel. The Ash Company had held the ford when they were ordered to hold for a day, and they had held for 3, and they had held past the point where holding made any sense to a frightened man, held into the 3rd night and the 4th, because that was the duty in front of them, and they did not put it down. They had broken every instinct that screams at a man to save himself, and they had done it for the men behind them, men they would never meet, men like a boy who would one day sit on his father's shoulders in a warm coat in a free square because the Ash Company did not run. And here was their commander going into the ground, and here was their last man, and the only thing standing between that last man and the one farewell he had come for was a velvet rope, a press of innocent shoulders, and the rigid gray line of the very foot guard that existed to honor exactly such men as these. I think Edmund Caro stood there and felt his oath and his debt take hold of him from 2 sides and pull, and I think for a moment, a long one, he did the hardest thing of all, which is nothing. He held, because that is what he had sworn to do and that is what he was. The discipline did not crack. Let me be very clear about that because it is the thing people get wrong when they tell this story carelessly. He did not snap. He did not lose hold of himself. A man who loses hold of himself is no use to anyone, and what came next had nothing of losing in it. What I think happened in the end is that Edmund Caro did the deepest thing a disciplined man can do, which is to understand which duty was the larger one. Because the post was a duty, yes, but the post served something. The whole gray iron line of it existed to honor the dead and to honor those who had paid for the kingdom in their own blood. And if the line held perfectly while the last of the Ash Company was folded down into the back of the crowd and lost, then the line would have kept its form and betrayed its purpose. It would have saluted the commander and abandoned his men. And Caro, who carried Vernon Ford in his own blood, who had been raised to know exactly what was over that old man's heart, understood, I think, that there are moments when standing still is not the keeping of the oath but the breaking of it, dressed up to look like the keeping. So he chose the larger duty. I saw it happen and I did not understand a single thing about it. What I saw was this. The nearest statue, the one I had spent the whole morning trying and failing to break, moved. It was not sudden. That is what I remember in my body even now. The slowness of it, the deliberateness, no jerk and no haste. He brought his reversed rifle up and across in one controlled motion and grounded it, set it carefully against his shoulder, the way a man sets down something he respects, and then Guardsman Edmund Caro took one step out of the gray line and into the open mouth of the corridor, and the whole square felt it. I have never forgotten the sound, because it was the absence of sound suddenly given a shape. A gasp, but not a loud one. Tens of thousands of people drawing one short breath at the same instant, a sound like a held wave, and then nothing. Because no one knew what they were seeing, and no one wanted to be the one who made the next sound. My father's hands tightened on my legs. I felt him go still beneath me. Out in the corridor, a guard had stepped from his post in the middle of a state funeral, and that was a thing that did not happen, that could not happen, that everyone in that square understood at once was either a terrible breaking or something none of us had a name for yet. He did not march back to the Abbey. That is what we all braced for in that frozen second, I think, some calamity at the coffin. He turned the other way. He turned out into the crowd, and he walked, unhurried and straight-backed across the open cobbles toward the rope, toward the press of people, toward a small folded old man in a good brushed coat 3 rows back, whom not one of us had even seen. And as he crossed, the crowd parted in front of him without a word, the way water parts, falling back from the rope to make a way. And old Walter Reeve, who had been pushed and folded and lost, was suddenly standing alone at the front of an open space with a king's guardsman walking straight toward him across the great square. And I have been told by those near enough to see his face that he did not understand it either, that he looked behind himself first. The way the unimportant always do when something important comes their way, certain it must be meant for someone else. It was meant for him. Caro reached the rope and stopped before the old man, and he did a thing then that I did not understand as a boy and cannot describe as a man without my throat closing, even now, even after all the times I have told it. He came to attention in front of old Walter Reeve, the last man of the Ash Company, and he saluted him, not the coffin, not the king. The old man, a king's guardsman in the middle of the state funeral of the kingdom's greatest soldier, broke his post and crossed the square and saluted a small, forgotten survivor in a mended coat, the way you salute the only authority you truly recognize. And then, the salute given, he reached across the rope and offered the old man his arm. I learned much later the few words that passed between them, because there were people close enough to hear, and what they heard they kept and repeated, the way you keep the few true relics a great mourning leaves behind. The old man, his hands shaking, his eyes streaming in the way of the very old, tried to say something and could not, and what he managed at last was the company's name, just the two words, Ash Company, said like a question, like a man who has not heard those words spoken aloud by another living soul in 20 years and cannot believe he has heard them now. And Caro, holding his arm, said, "I know, sir, my grandfather, Vernon Ford." And the old man looked at him then, really looked, and something passed between the very old and the very young that I think only the two of them ever fully held, and the old man let himself be helped over the rope and into the open square. Then they walked to the coffin together. I want you to see it the way the square saw it, because the square will never forget it, and neither will I, a young guardsman in deep foot guard gray, straight and steady, holding the whole weight of a folded old man against his side, the two of them crossing the open cobbles toward the gun carriage where the old marshal lay under the flag and the sword, taking it as slow as the old man needed, which was very slow indeed, the bell still tolling over them. The whole vast crowd uncovered and silent and risen up onto its toes, and not one official, not one usher, not one mounted officer moving to stop it. Because by then everyone, even the boy on his father's shoulders, even the men whose whole duty was order, understood that something was happening that was larger than the order it broke, and that to stop it would be the only real disgrace. They reached the carriage. Caro steadied the old man before the coffin. And old Walter Reeve, the last of the men who held the Ford, stood as straight as 60 years and a hard winter and a great grief would let him stand, which was not very straight, and he lifted his trembling right hand to the brim of nothing, for he had uncovered like everyone else, and he held that salute to his old commander, to the man who had carried their names to a stone, to the whole gone company of his frozen youth, for as long as his failing arm could hold it. While a king's guardsman stood at his side and bore him up so he would not fall. I have seen great things since. I am an old man myself now, older than I ever expected to be, and I have stood at coronations and weddings and the launchings of ships, and I have seen the kingdom in its glory more times than I can number. I have never seen anything to match a small man in a mended coat saluting a coffin while a young soldier held him on his feet. There was nothing grand about it. That is exactly what made it the grandest thing I ever saw. Everything else that morning had been arranged, drilled, ordered, paid for, a kingdom's wealth and a kingdom's discipline laid out to honor a dead hero. And the one thing that broke all the arrangement, the one unplanned and forbidden thing, was the only thing in the whole of it that was simply, unbearably true. And here is where the story turns from a thing that happened into a thing the kingdom keeps, because a guardsman had broken his post. By every hard rule, a reckoning had to follow, and the whole silent square which had let the moment happen now held one more breath, waiting to see what the new king would do. He was young, the new king, newly come to the throne and untested, and this was among the first great public duties of his reign, and I have often thought since what a thing it must have been to be him in that moment, to stand on the abbey steps and watch a soldier shatter the solemn order of your first state funeral, and to know that 10,000 eyes were about to learn what kind of king you meant to be by what you did next. What he did next is the reason there is a story at all. He came down the abbey steps. Alone, on foot in his black, down the gray stone steps and out into the corridor where no plan had him walking, and the square watched him come, and he crossed to the carriage where the old man stood propped against the young guardsman before the coffin, and the king of Marenhold stopped before old Walter Reeve. And he uncovered, though a king need not uncover for anyone, and he bowed his head to the old soldier. And then the king straightened and came to attention, and saluted him too. I was 9 years old, and I did not understand sovereignty or duty or the weight of a crown, but I understood, the way a child understands the important things, in the body before the mind, that I was watching the highest man in the kingdom honor the lowest, that something had been turned the right way up that I had not even known was upside down, and I felt my father's chest move beneath me in a way that I realized, with a child's shock, meant that my father was weeping, my father who never wept. And I looked out across the square, and the whole square was weeping, this vast field of bareheaded people in the iron cold, not making a sound, only their faces wet and shining, every one of them turned toward a small old man and the young soldier who would not let him fall, and the king who had come down his own steps to stand among them. And then the salute broke, and the swell came. Not a cheer. You do not cheer at a funeral, and no one did. It was something else. Something I have never heard before or since, a low, long sound that rose up out of the whole crowd at once, a kind of sob with the kingdom's whole heart in it, the sound a people makes when it has just seen the best of itself and cannot hold the sound in any longer. It rolled across the square and up the gray face of the abbey and away over the rooftops, and underneath it the bell tolled on, and that is the sound the morning ended on, and I have spent my life trying to describe it, and these are the closest words I have ever found. They buried Field Marshal Lord Halloran that day with all the honor the kingdom could spend, beneath the abbey floor with the old kings, and it was a magnificent funeral, and almost no one remembers a single arranged moment of it. What they remember is the one moment no one arranged. Old Walter Reeve died that spring. He had held on, I have always believed, for exactly the morning I have described, the way the very old sometimes hold on for one last necessary thing, and then, the thing done, let go. They buried him with his medals, in his one good coat, and there was a guardsman at his small graveside who had asked leave to be there, and it was Edmund Carow, and he stood the watch alone in the rain for a man almost no one came to mourn. The last of the Ash Company laid down at last beside the long frozen rest of them in the kingdom's memory, if not in the kingdom's ground, and Carow himself. The reckoning that the hard rules demanded never came. The king saw to that, they say, though the king never made a show of it. There are some who will tell you Edmund Carow was quietly raised, given his sergeant's stripes and then more, ending his service decorated and honored, and there are others who will tell you he asked for none of it and wanted only to go on standing his post. And I do not know which is true, and I have decided it does not matter. What matters is the only thing that was ever in question that morning, which is whether a man's deepest duty is to the form of his oath or to the thing the oath exists to serve. And Edmund Carow answered it, with one slow step out of an iron line, more truly than 1,000 speeches ever could. I have told you I understand the morning better each time I tell it, and here, near the end, is the most of what I have come to understand. The boy I was thought the guards were statues because they did not move, and thought their not moving was the whole of their strength. The man I am knows that their strength was never in the stillness. The stillness was only the shape their strength took when stillness was what duty required. The real strength, the thing that made them more than iron and more than drill, was that underneath the perfect frozen form there was a living man, with a heart that could still recognize a debt and a badge, and the last survivor of a company that died so the kingdom could go on. And the discipline existed not to kill that living heart, but to govern it, to hold it ready, so that on the one morning in 10,000 when the living heart was needed, it would step out of the line at exactly the right moment and do exactly the right thing, and then, the thing done, step back and be iron again. Anyone can hold still. It is harder than it looks, but in the end anyone with enough cold pride can do it. What Edmund Carow did was harder. He held still through everything that did not require him, and he moved once for the one thing that did, and he knew the difference. That is the whole of soldiering, I have come to think, and maybe the whole of being a man. Not the never moving. The knowing when. My father carried me home through the cold that afternoon on shoulders that must have been past aching, and we did not say much, the way you do not say much after a thing too large for words, but somewhere on the way he stopped and set me down and crouched to my level the way he had that morning, and he said, "You'll remember this. When you're old, you'll be glad you stood for it." And I said yes, the way a child says yes to a thing he does not yet understand and only means he heard. He was right, of course. He has been gone many years now, and the king is gone, and Caro is gone, and Walter Reeve has been gone the longest of all, and the great cold square has held 100 other gatherings since that have faded into nothing. But I am old, as my father said I would be, and I am glad, as he said I would be, that I stood for it, that I was there, that I can say with my own mouth and my own memory that I saw it. The morning the statue stepped out of the line and crossed the square, and held up the last old soldier of a forgotten company so that he could lift his trembling hand one final time, and a whole kingdom learned in one held breath the difference between the keeping of a form and the keeping of faith. That is the story. I have told it to my children, and they have told it to theirs, and it has grown a little smoother in the telling, the way stories do, and people who were not there sometimes say it surely could not have happened just so. But I was there on my father's shoulders, 9 years old, and a scarf wound too many times around my throat, and I am here to tell you that it did. It happened just so. And some things you go and stand for, so that later you can say you did.